we have a very special guest, Dorothy Parvaz, who comes from a very exotic background, but also a very traditional background in the sense of her journalism foundation. She started working was it an internship or a full job in Japan?
Job. It was an internship that turned into a job.
Okay, well, which is the best kind of internship, right? Anyway, she went from that to 10 years at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which was a great feisty competitor to the Seattle Times for many years, and she was there during sort of the heyday of the fight. And then from there, she moved on to cover something that goes back to her own sort of experience as a person with a root in more than one world, as an Iranian American. And she has been working for Al Jazeera for the last 6 years, I believe, covering human rights and conflicts based in Qatar for the last 4 years. Reflecting the business, she has been tasked with the different disciplines of journalism that exist today, preparing things for the web, helping coordinate, the different types of media that we consider necessary in any sort of story today, and in the process, exposing herself to the traditional reporter's risk and going some places that are very dangerous. And just a list of her awards, I think, makes some of that clear. Breaking News Award from the Online News Association for coverage of the Egyptian uprising. The National Press Club's Press Freedom Before Correspondence Award in recognition of courageous reporting in 2011. Susan Hutchinson Bosch Award for Perseverance and Quiet Courage. She's been a World Press Fellow of the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom, a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, like I believe our other current Snedden chair, and has won the Hearst Newspaper Award for Mentor Reporting, and he's been honored for her courage that was tested when she herself was incarcerated by during covering the Syrian conflict. So with that, let me give you Dorothy Parvaz. And thank you very much.
Can you guys hear me okay? A little louder? Okay. How about that? Better? Okay. So first of all, before I start, I just want to apologize for anybody who saw me going the wrong way outside. I kind of forgot I was driving a car and went into full toboggan mode and was just, it was a while before I realized none of the signs were facing me. So I'm really sorry if I alarmed anybody out there. I'm not used to this much snow. It's very pretty. Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming out tonight. The subject is, when I first proposed this topic, I feel like we lived in a slightly different world. It was before the president of one of the most powerful, wealthy countries in the world signed an executive order banning migrants, refugees, green card holders, visa holders, academics from 7 countries in the Muslim world from coming to the U.S. Now that executive order has been turned on its head somewhat. We're waiting for the 2.0 version. Next week we'll see what happens. But I just saw on Twitter that a senior White House official told CNN that, quote, the situation has gotten more dangerous in recent years. Yeah, for the refugees. And more broadly, the refugee program has been a major incubator for terrorism. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of evidence they show to support that. Now, up until this point, covering the story meant focusing on certain elements that were digestible to the general public. So in addition to reporting from the ground, you sort of focused on, certainly our readership at Al Jazeera was really interested in how some countries in Middle East, North Africa, mostly Middle East, seem to be shouldering the bulk of the burden when it comes to taking refugees, especially if you look at the case of Syria. 90% of Syrian refugees are in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. Iraq, you might have heard, has its own problems. So when you hear of European countries complaining about all these Syrian refugees coming, consider where most of them are. So that goes to the second element that we focused on a lot, which was European Union countries really resisting even a minimal quota of taking people. They just, for political reasons, maybe pragmatic reasons, depending on how you stand, just weren't interested in taking them, and still aren't, except for a handful of countries. And to some extent, maybe lesser for our readers, looking at the US sort of being slow to take on more Syrian refugees specifically, although the US does take a lot of people from Latin American countries. But here's the thing, you could say that the story has maybe changed in some political dimension, depending on how you feel about it. Maybe it's political, maybe, as I said, it's pragmatic, maybe you really feel there is a security threat. So maybe that element of the story has changed with regards to how the US will now deal with this. But here's what hasn't changed globally, and that's the thing, is this is a global story. This isn't just about Syria, it's not just about the US, it's not just about, you know, Germany or maybe Sweden. I'm not really sure what's happening there, but you know, it's not, you know, we're looking at a crisis. And somebody at lunch challenged me on this today, or asked me to look up some numbers. So this is in fact the worst humanitarian crisis in terms of refugees that we've seen since World War II. It's worse now than World War II. Close to 70 million people are on the run right now because of violence, not any other reason. So not like persecution in some way or an environmental issue, violence. So wars, fighting between non-state factions within the country. So what hasn't changed is the fact that these people are seeing their schools, their hospitals, their homes turn to dust. They're digging their relatives out of the rubble. That's still the same. They're still wondering how to keep their kids alive another night, and they're still trying to figure out where to run. And it's also worth noting that just roughly over half of those children, half the people on the run are children. More than half, just over 50%. And that's an incredibly vulnerable population. A lot of them are unaccompanied minors. Which, by the way, it's worth also noting that this is not a homogenous thing. It's not just, you know, in the Middle East where there's war, or Africa where there's famine. There's environmental displacement for floods. Maybe you recall, because it was kind of visually interesting, the earthquake and tsunami in Japan in 2011, and how people were displaced. And that's a tiny chain of subtropical islands. There's not far to run, you know. So you're trying to outrun radiation. You don't really have far to go. You have Latin American countries where a lot of mostly young boys are being just sent up north to escape narco violence, right? Narco gang violence. And, you know, from places like Guatemala or Honduras. And they're not getting that far for, you know, Mexico is building its own wall, by the way, south on its southern border. So, you know, that's going to be a bigger challenge and a bigger story, hopefully covered more in the US, because it's not really being covered that well. But for the most part, what I've been looking at has been the conflict refugees. So refugees, it's important to note, that's a status you get once you make an application as an asylum seeker. The application is approved, and then you become officially a refugee by the UNHCR, right? That's the UN's refugee agency. Until then, you're an asylum seeker. Or a lot of these people don't even want to seek that kind of status. They're just migrants. They just need somewhere to be for a while until things calm down. They don't want to abandon their countries. They don't want to abandon their homes. Consider how hard you guys have worked for whatever security you have in your homes, right? Now think about what it would take for you to just decide, I gotta go. Maybe with my family, maybe without. With minimal belongings, minimal means, under incredibly heartbreaking, devastating circumstances. It's not a natural inclination. And a lot of people do want to go back as soon as they can. So they're not necessarily seeking refugee status or citizenship in other countries. They just need a place to be for a while. And so within some countries, people can find areas within their own countries to do that. For Iraq right now is a big example. So The Mosul offensive, which started in October, is, I don't know how much of that you guys have followed, but basically ISIS took over a bunch of towns in Iraq, one of them Mosul. And in September, President Obama announced that they were going to go in, clear them out. The problem is there's over 1.5, I think, civilians stuck there with really nowhere to go except mostly north towards the Kurdish region. So these people are displaced, but they're displaced within their own country as far as they can go. And where do they go? So I went to this Kurdish region and took a look at the camps. And these camps are so close to the front lines that it's freaky. How do these people have any sense of security? I don't know. It's somewhere, like some of them are seriously 10, 15 kilometers away from front lines, right? Like the Peshmerga, where basically like they'll let you go that far and that's it. But it was weird to me because as a journalist, they would stop me a little further back and I'd say, oh, but there's a camp there. There's like actually children sleeping in that camp. Like, yeah, but you should hang back. So they're in these massive sprawling camps. And these are, in Iraq, the Kurdish region that I went to, pretty well ordered, to give you an idea. I mean, they're hard. It's hard living, make no mistake. But they have tents, they have, some medical care. There's not much in the way of school for those kids there, really, at all. And there's a big mix of different types of camps. So you have, the internally displaced Iraqis, you have the Syrians, you might have the Yazidis, they're a religious minority rather from the region. So these camps are everywhere and they're sprawling like, Dibaga camp is one big camp that, opened up like 3 years ago. And there's now 4 Dibaga camps. It's just like sprouting out. It's insane to consider. But it's beyond that even. If you think about every time you hear of an outbreak of not like formal war or even a revolution or an uprising, but fighting, how many times have you, turned on the radio or the news and heard about a clash somewhere in Somalia or South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo? When that happens, you can be certain that civilians are being caught in the crossfire. And you can be certain that they're running. And sometimes they're in these tiny little refugee camps, informal camps. Sometimes they're just moving en masse. From Eritrea, a lot of people tend to move across the desert to Libya. Like that's their idea of a safe haven for a while. Process that. That's if they make it that far. That's a treacherous journey. They make it there. They have to have like at least $1,000, maybe a bit more, to get on a boat to go to southern Italy. But what happens? They get to Libya, and Libya is a place where people are desperate. So some cop will pick them up, throw them in jail, take their money. Right, so you're like an 18-year-old Eritrean, don't know anybody, male or female. You get taken to jail. God knows what happens to you in there. Your money taken away. You have to come out, somehow find a way to earn another $1,000, $2,000 in Libya to maybe get on a boat, to maybe live, to make it across to southern Italy, where the economy is horrible and nobody really wants you, to then try to make it to Germany or Denmark or Sweden or somewhere where somebody might give you a chance, right? In fact, it's not just fighting between non-state actors. There was a story earlier this week out of the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, about footage that had come out showing police, I believe, was the military, actually killing civilians. So this isn't just gangs. These are the people charged with keeping them safe. And then we have ongoing, decades-long type refugee situations like Palestinians. You have generations living in refugee camps. I interviewed this guy who was born in a refugee camp in Syria, like 20 years ago. His dad's Palestinian, which means he has no right to Syrian citizenship. War breaks out in Syria, they have to leave Syria. Refugee twice over, and not entitled to anything that's a benefit that like nobody recognizes him as a Syrian refugee because he's Palestinian. But, you know, so where does he go? What rights does he have? So covering this crisis, depending on where you are geographically, can be really tricky. Sometimes because you have no access to the things that you need, basically as a reporter, to get the story done. A government that's done an unfortunately decent job of keeping things on, you know, on lockdown, every pun intended, is Australia. So you have, you know, basically people coming from South Asia on boats trying to get to Australia. Australia has done a number of interesting things, all of them against international law. They've kept them on boats for up to a month offshore. They've actually hired traffickers, like pirates, to divert the boats. They've paid criminals to do this. And they've paid island nations, Manus and Nauru, to take these people, and they built prison facilities there. And you best believe they don't give press passes to this stuff, right? So how do you cover something when you don't have access to the people being affected by it? So, you know, you do what you can. You rely on NGOs who have spies and whistleblowers. It's not ideal because, of course, you're not there yourself. And, of course, the Australian government says, no, the conditions aren't that bad. What are you talking about? But then the UN files a report and Human Rights Watch files a report showing, you know, the rampant sexual abuse of children. There's people setting themselves on fire, sewing their lips shut. So it, you know, it doesn't sound like everything's fine, but, you know, you don't have access to it. But even when you do have access to the story, when you do have access to people, it can be really difficult to have a conversation with them because they've been through so much. And sometimes you don't know what they've been through. You have a vague idea. Look, of course, I mean, if you read the news, if you cover the news, I'm guessing, you know, death, destruction, lots of violations to dignity and rights. God knows what they've seen. But as a reporter, it's my job to bring the unspeakable into the realm of the spoken, right? How else am I going to tell the story? And this is it. So I could write a story with a bunch of numbers. I mean, you just go to a UN website and you'll see charts and graphs and numbers of people in tents and camps and countries. And those are all, data is super important, don't get me wrong. But without the stories of these individuals, I'm not humanizing anything to you, right? And so maybe when someone tells you that they're all terrorists, it seems possible. I don't know. But, you know, I think back to this guy, actually, this guy's father. So this young man, I met his father in Kabul. His father was a sound engineer at, or a sound designer, I think it's how he described his job, at a Tolo news agency. Tolo is basically like the CNN of Afghanistan. So I think, I don't know if you can see the deck, but it's pretty devastating. So this guy tells me the story. He comes into the Al Jazeera bureau, which is just a terribly boring looking office. It's really unremarkable. Sits down and starts talking to me about what happened. And I vetted this guy, like this is why I'm interviewing him. He basically tells me, this is the abbreviated version, that he took his wife and 2 children to Turkey with tourist visas, then paid for the best boat they could find, not one of those inflatable ones, a nice solid wooden one with an Afghan captain he could talk to. And 15 minutes into this journey, the engine gets out, the boat goes vertical and sinks. It's December. Now, they all have life jackets, but it's December in the Mediterranean. It is cold. So within a few minutes, basically, the children start dying. So him and his wife are holding on to their kids, and their kids freeze to death in their clutches. And the water is really violent and choppy and takes their children away. And he turns to his wife and says, you know, let's just take our life vests off. I can't. And she says, hold on. And he doesn't know why. She says, hold on, a little longer, a little longer. So he does, and by sunup, a fishing vessel comes by. They get pulled out of the water. They get taken to a medical facility where he learns that his wife was 3 months pregnant and miscarried in the water. The bodies of the children are found. That's the son. And the daughter was in the other screen. He was 9. And his daughter was 8. Elohe. And, you know, these are the only photos that he had of them. He couldn't even keep anything of them because his wife basically was catatonic and out of her mind with grief and would keep looking at anything that belonged to them. So he had to take all images out of the house. So they came back to Afghanistan with 2 small coffins and nothing else. So when dealing with stories like this, it can be a real challenge to find someone who can actually articulate what happened to them. And this man cried, by the way, the whole time. The whole time. The guy I was working with a local producer. He was like, he's the photographer who he took that photo. It's not a great one, but he does better work. This one's also him down here. Excellent photographer. Jawad, he and his wife had recently had a son. And so he's watching this guy speak, and I can tell he's barely holding it together. And I just let him go home after that because, I mean, I could barely function, and I had to go write the story. And this is the thing, is you're dealing with people who are so fragile, and the only thing you can offer as a counter to why I need to talk to them is that you have a damn deadline. And so you need to make it a more compelling reason for why they're sharing their stories with you, why this matters, why people need to read what's happening to them. And culture plays a huge part in this, right? So, you know, I interviewed an elderly Japanese couple who lost their organic farm, 7 generations in their family. They took enormous pride in what they produced. And it was horribly contaminated with cesium after the nuclear meltdown started there in 2011. And, you know, the Japanese are not prone to expressing need in public. I mean, most of us aren't. You don't want to be beholden to anybody. No, it's not a natural condition. And for them, culturally, it wasn't easy to talk about it, but they'd gotten to the point, and I spent so many days in a snowy field with them before the guy would actually talk to me about his frustrations and what the government had done. And essentially, their farm was completely contaminated like a lot of other farms, and the government just sweeps up the top 5 centimeters of the soil, bags it, and stores it on your own land. So 1/3 of your land is essentially lost to contaminated soil, and then you're supposed to just trust them that it's going to be okay to plant in the rest. Yeah. So, I mean, this is the same government that told them over and over again that this nuclear plant was safe despite the, you know, how earthquake prone the country is. And so, you know, sometimes it's a matter of culture and you can work around it. Another example is when I was in northern Iraq and I was in a Yazidi camp. Again, that's that religious minority in the region. And so several towns and villages that were Yazidi were taken over by ISIS a couple years ago, and they very systematically separated the families. The men were killed and the women were taken. And these girls, you might have read stuff about this. It was kind of a sensational headline, sex slaves, ISIS sex slaves, you know, which is more or less accurate for what happened to them. But you can't sit in a tent with 2 teenage girls who've been to hell and back, somehow are trying to pull their lives together in a very religiously kind of conservative community and lean over and say, so, sex slave, huh? There's going to be, in front of male relatives, there's going to be no answer to that. So you have to find ways around it. So one thing that I found was helpful was, my question was, so you were forced to take a husband? That they could answer, yes, I was. He was a real jerk. And then they would tell you, about one husband and then the other and then the other. And these girls were freed because there are these sort of brokers who sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly work with ISIS fighters and allow the girls to contact the family and say, I'm here, and they basically allow the family to buy them back. $7,000, $5,000, $10,000, depending on the fighter, depending on the girl, depending on the family. So these girls have literally been bought back by their families. And sometimes the person who's talking to you is in no shape to talk to you at all, but maybe people around them, they're sort of in the middle of this trauma with them and they're not aware of it. So one girl I was talking to had been purchased back, released about a month before then, and maybe 5 minutes into the interview, somebody just walks into the tent we're sitting in and puts a baby in her lap and walks out. Well, that's a beautiful baby. Girl, yours? Yes. And there's no way that child was old enough to be had before this ordeal that she went through. But she said, here's all I'm going to tell you. I was married before I was taken. This is the child I had with my husband. It was not. There's no way that kid was old enough. And that's all I can say about it. And of course the interview is over at that point, right? You just sort of have to allow for certain things to happen in the course of covering this crisis. But sometimes it's not just the families who are kind of oblivious or the community. It can be the very government that's supposed to be looking after these people. In Afghanistan, there's a lot of internally displaced people, IDPs, because there's actually like active war going on in at least 12 provinces. It used to be just the Taliban and some drone strikes, and now there's ISIS. So they have the multi-pack of hell over there. And so outside of Kabul alone, there are about 50 camps of varying sizes of people displaced from within the country. A lot of them are from places you probably heard of, like Helmand or Kunduz, right? Now, some of the older camps are better than you would think. There's at least tents. There's a UNICEF tent where there's classes a couple of days a week for the kids. There's some medical help. The World Food Program swings by and gives them vouchers and food, a couple times a week. There's others that are not that great. I mean, they are piled high with garbage, just unbelievable filth. And by the way, when you go into these camps to talk to these people, they will still break out any bit of food they have, place it as nicely as possible on a tray and bring it out to you. Because they're just so damn happy someone wants to write down anything they have to say. So, this is not what you would call living off the fat of the land, is what I'm getting at. It's pretty hard living. It's pretty miserable. A lot of them just cry talking about wanting to go back home. I had a home, I had a house, I had a job, I had a life, I had a farm, but no more. And I want to go back, but I can't right now. So I went to the Minister of Refugees and Returnees there. This is a ministry where they're in charge of looking after these people, making sure they're safe, making sure they have land where they can live, at least temporarily, making sure they have a path to rebuild their lives. And I'm speaking to the spokesman. And this is not an informal chat. This isn't just something he said like off the cuff and haha, I caught it. We're having a formal interview. And he says, these people, they're freeloaders. And we're doing this in Farsi, and I repeated it to him. So, did you just call them freeloaders? He said, yes, they are. There's a few legitimate ones, but they're mostly freeloaders. Yeah, all you can do is just put that in quotes and move on with it, but that's how their own government sees them as well. And that's the thing, by the way. I'm just going to, I know I've been blathering on for a while. If you look at how things are covered and the hierarchy of how people think who people think should be helped. Obviously, Syrian refugees. Everyone's worried about Syrian refugees, right? They're the only ones. But any other kind of migrant, any other kind of person who has to move for a particular reason is kind of, I mean, especially in Europe. I don't know if you read the European press much. If you really want to get a clear view of what I'm talking about, go read the Daily Mail. It is, you know, the term economic migrant is on par with parasite and scum, right? And I've thought about it for a long time, and when I look at what they call an economic migrant, at the end of the day, all I see is a person who seeks the dignity of a job and a way of, you know, supporting themselves, their families, being part of a community, maybe permanently, maybe temporarily. And for some reason, rights aren't granted to them based on their citizenship, so, which is against all UN convention. But we're seeing this, right? Not just in the US, not just in Europe, not just in Australia, all over the world, where your rights are tied to your citizenship. You guys have this beautiful blue American passport, right? It's gorgeous. The world is yours. You need a job somewhere, you can go get it. That's amazing. That is not a right that's afforded to people from most other countries that we're talking about. You know, they're trapped. You know, come what may, you know, war, famine, hell or high water. So these are the things that I try to keep in mind when I cover these stories. Looking at very fundamental connections between who they are, who are all the same, honestly. You'd be surprised, or not. But I think a lot of readers are sometimes at the very common basic things that tie us together. We might speak different languages from a lot of these people, might have a different religion, you might, you know, eat different food. But at the end of the day, you're just looking for a safe place to put down your head and wake up in the morning. So with that,